Hello, my name is The Political Kid, and this is going to be the first time in a while that I've done one of these types of videos. So basically, I'll be summarizing what would happen to kind of American politics, history, if Harold Stassen won the 1948 Republican primaries and went on to win against Harry Truman in the general election. So basically, some brief information. Harold Stassen was a Republican. He'd been trying to get into, he was in politics, but he tried to get into more national politics for a while. And the closest he ever got was 1948 when he received a good amount of the votes. And he actually was the one of the two people first ever on a national debate when they had a primary debate between Thomas Dewey and Harold Stassen. However, he would lose, but then go on to run 10 times in his life overall, which is crazy. But what if he did win the primaries? What if he did so good in the debate where he was able to ease through to the presidency, beating Truman's trying comeback and bringing conservative republicanism instead of the more moderate Eisenhower years that we got in the 50s. So basically, and at the start, Harold Sasson would instead like try to get more into congressional politics and try to uh, claim a lot of effort for bringing a lot of what would be later the Marshall Plan to Europe, so he could gain a lot of national prominence. And then he would probably, if he were to win the primary, he would need to do really well in debate and have more people tune into the debate so it would actually matter more. And because of this, he'd be barely able to beat Thomas Dewey in the primary. And if you think this is a stretch, I'll remind you of something. Thomas Dewey also ran in 1944 and lost against FDR. So, he did lose, and Republicans were very confident they would win, even though they didn't, but they were very confident they would win. It just really mattered who would be their nominee, so it isn't too much of a stretch to say, hey, Thomas Dewey lost, so let's just get a moderate, even more safer choice than Thomas Dewey, and let him compete against Truman. So this would later happen, and then uh, Harold Stassen would probably still pick Earl Warren to be his nominee for VP, and they would go on to win. Then later, they'd probably they would start off with the Korean War, which would be very difficult for them since they probably would be inclined to intervene more directly, even though Harold Stassen was a little isolated, was kind of a bias because there was a lot of isolationists within the Republican Party. Uh, he would still help Korea out, but try to make a more defensive measure and probably be more diplomatic with PRC because they'd be aware, hey, there's this giant, very powerful nation to the north, and we want to make sure that if we go up the Korean Peninsula, they won't invade us. So this time, instead, in so to not make a war, there would be a peace deal where Korea would get the majority of the Korean peninsula, and then there would be a demilitarized zone in the north of Korean peninsula annexed by China, and yeah, so there would not be that much conflict, and it would be a united Korea, but still a demilitarized Korean puppet state in the north. This would be a huge diplomatic win for the Republicans, since in our in our actual timeline, this just bogged down Truman's chances forever winning in 1952, and also the Democrats' chances of winning 1952. But because of this, Republicans would have even an even easier time winning in 1952, getting Harold Stassen re-election. the main problem would be the 1956 election. Now, Harold Stassen would be limited to 2 terms, since I would believe that he would probably pass the amendment that would limit the presidential terms to only 2. And then, so we could have Earl Warren succeed him, but I think what would be more interesting if Richard Nixon didn't go in 1960 or 1968, but 1956. I mean, he was very young. He was very ambitious, and he was a representative, sure, and he worked in Congress for a while, but he was a very just new out of the blue conservative who would just praise whatever communist attacks within the government were going on. So he would go after communists, people who wanted free healthcare and stuff, and he would kind of be that wing of the party. And due to Harold Stassen being more moderate, there would probably be a growing movement to kind of have a more conservative president. And to make up with that, Earl Warren would also be allowed to run for a 3rd time as vice president. Then I would believe Richard Nixon would win. I mean, the just popularity of this time. I mean, they would probably deal with the Suez Canal crisis the same way that Eisenhower did. So yeah, they would cruise through the presidency. And Nixon, he would not win 1960. He would actually lose re-election to Lyndon B. Johnson. And why not JFK? Why is JFK not running or being the nominee? He would run. JFK would run. However, due to their a lot of losses, the Democrats would be very interested in let's just get a candidate in the White House already. So they would pick the moderate Lyndon B. Johnson with John F. Kennedy as VP. This would be a role reversal of what happened in our timeline. And due to the kind of economic troubles of 1960, like the 1956 to 1960s, or 1960, there would be a very great chance that Lyndon Johnson would win with a sizable majority. Earl Warren wouldn't be with Nixon for the 4th time. They would probably pick someone like Henry Cabot Lodge. But it doesn't really matter, considering they would lose. And Earl Warren would continue on and later be nominated for Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, like in our timeline. So Lyndon B. Johnson would win in 1960, start to even escalate more until 1964, where he wouldn't be assassinated. Like in 1963, he wouldn't be assassinated, so he'd be able to run for re-election in 1964 and probably win, but with less. Barry Goldwater would probably win a little bit more if he was the nominee, but maybe not. Maybe it was. Actually, no, forget that. Nelson Rockefeller would probably be their nominee for 1964, but he would probably lose. And in 1968, it would be John F. Kennedy, who's not assassinated, against George Romney, the father of Mitt Romney and the governor of Michigan. And honestly, due to Vietnam, which would be even more involved in, since Lyndon B. Johnson would have more time to get into that affair, George Romney would probably win. And with a Republican as vice president, I don't know who that would specifically be. Maybe even Ronald Reagan, because he was slightly considered for the nomination back in 1968. So, you know what? Yeah, let's do that. George Romney and Ronald Reagan win the 1968 election. They would probably continue on Since they would be so opposed to the Lyndon B. Johnson administration and George Romney is more of a moderate compared to Nixon, he'd probably move away from the Vietnam issue and get them in even more better electoral victory in 1972. They would win re-election and probably have George McGovern try to run against them, but also failing like they did in our timeline. Now, the pinnacle of this thing, brother of the last vice president, JFK, would be RFK, who wouldn't run in 1968. RFK would run in 1976 against Ronald Reagan, the vice president, and guess who would win? Watergate wouldn't happen, however, due to just political corruption still happening during this timeline and just boredom for the current political establishment. I would predict that Ronald Reagan with Gerald Ford as his VP nominee would probably go to lose to RFK and Ted Kennedy, the RFK and Ted Kennedy ticket, and RFK would cruise through 1976, hit a stop Iran. So what would happen in this timeline? So Eisenhower would be the person to coup the regime in the 50s. However, remember, we had and Harold Stassen and Nixon who would probably not do a regime change in Iran. So their democratically elected government, because I mean the British couldn't do that, couldn't really regime change on their own. So a constitutional monarchy would probably be put in place in Iran, and this would lead to a more stable regime, not causing as much turmoil to the RFK administration in the late 70s for our timeline. And they would probably win re-election against George Bush Sr., who would probably run in 1980. Then 1984, we could have Ted Kennedy run. We could have Ted Kennedy run, but I feel like a more better choice would be Jimmy Carter, considering like the administration of RFK and Ted Kennedy would kind of have a issue of nepotism, considering they're both literally brothers. I mean, they would be popular, but like they wouldn't really want the Kennedy administration to go on again. And they would probably have Jimmy Carter run in 1984 with Ted Kennedy still as VP. They would go on to win in 1984. Ted Kennedy would later go seek the presidency in 1988 after Jimmy Carter would not seek re-election. However, a very conservative Pat Buchanan would win the Republican nomination, and after a very long time of Democrat control, would win 1988, win 1992, and then Bill Clinton would win 1996, probably, and in 2000 I would predict Bill Clinton would be reelected. John McCain would probably win in 2004, and Barack Obama in 2008 would win, 2012 win. Sorry, I'm just going through this pretty fast for the 21st century and the late 20th century, so I'm trying to think of people who would probably run. I predict that Marco Rubio would be more of a realistic candidate in this timeline, because the Republican Party, they would be conservative from the Pat Buchanan era, but then they would moderate to a more Harold Stassen type, so they would probably, like the moderate wing of the party, so they'd probably nominate Marco Rubio. He would probably win against Hillary Clinton and probably actually win a re-election because, I mean, Joe Biden wouldn't be the most supported by his own party even. So, yeah. And I don't know who would win in 2024. Maybe if I'll say Nikki Haley, honestly, because that would be a logical successor to Marco Rubio, and a maybe, I don't know, but that's gonna be it. That was the first alternative history video that I've done for a while. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.